The arrogance in security guard Marcus Thompson's smirk was unmistakable as he approached the middle-aged woman standing too close to the World War II tank display. Her crime? Acting strangely, muttering to herself, and making other visitors uncomfortable. Impossible for someone like her to have any real military connection, he thought. His colleagues chuckled along as they prepared to escort her out, watching tears form in her eyes as they dismissed what they assumed was the behavior of someone mentally unstable. Then she opened her worn leather bag. The Navy Cross that tumbled out caught the museum's artificial lighting like a beacon. The engraved name on the medal matched the brass nameplate on the very tank she'd been studying. The security guards' faces drained of colour as they realised their terrible mistake. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more tales of unsung heroes and moments when respect is earned through sacrifice. Eleanor Tank Rodriguez adjusted the strap of her weathered brown leather bag as she walked through the entrance of the National War Museum. At 52, she carried herself with quiet dignity that most visitors didn't notice, her movements economical and purposeful, despite her civilian appearance. The morning sunlight streaming through glass doors illuminated silver streaks in her dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail unchanged for decades. The museum buzzed with Saturday morning crowds. School groups clustered around interactive displays, while teachers struggled to maintain order. Elderly veterans moved slowly between exhibits, their faces reflecting memories only they could access. Tourist families snapped photos, children more interested in gift shops than history lessons. Eleanor paid little attention. She had come for one specific reason, drawn by a phone call 3 days earlier from museum researcher Dr. James Mitchell, who had tracked down her contact information after years of searching. Mrs. Rodriguez, we finally have confirmation. The tank in our World War II Pacific Theatre exhibit is the same M4A3E8 Sherman you commanded during the Battle of Luzon. We thought you might want to see it. She had driven 8 hours from Nevada to reach this moment, carrying memories she rarely shared with anyone. The years since discharge had been kind in some ways, cruel in others, but they had all led back to this machine that had been both salvation and torment during the darkest days of 1945. The Pacific Theatre exhibit occupied the museum's largest hall, its centerpiece a fully restored Sherman tank positioned behind velvet ropes with dramatic lighting. The placard read, M4A38 Sherman Fury's Daughter, Battle of Luzon, 1945, commanded by unknown tank crew, credited with destroying 12 enemy positions and saving approximately 200 Allied personnel during 3-day siege of Hill 247. Eleanor stopped 6 feet from the rope barrier, eyes fixed on the tank's turret. The restoration team had done excellent work, but they'd missed details. The small dent above the driver's vision port where shrapnel struck during their second day. The barely visible scratch marks on the main gun where they'd scraped against fallen trees. The faded paint that once displayed her tank's nickname, now covered by the museum's interpretation. "Ma'am, you need to stay behind the barrier rope," called a voice across the hall. Eleanor looked up to see a young security guard approaching, uniform crisp, posture suggesting someone who took authority seriously despite obvious inexperience. She glanced down, realizing she'd unconsciously stepped closer, hand reaching toward metal once as familiar as her own skin. "Of course," she replied quietly, stepping back. "I was just looking." Marcus Thompson, senior security guard on duty, noticed the interaction from his position near the entrance. At 35, he'd worked museum security 8 years, long enough to develop practiced eyes for potential troublemakers. Elderly visitors who got emotional around exhibits were common, but required careful management to prevent disruptions. He observed Eleanor for several minutes, noting how she moved around the tank in slow circles, lips occasionally moving in apparent one-sided conversation. When families with children approached, he watched her shrink away, discomfort with crowds evident. "Thompson," radioed colleague Brad Henley from across the hall. "You seeing this lady by the Sherman? She's been there 45 minutes, just staring and talking to herself." Marcus keyed his radio. "Copy. I'm monitoring. She hasn't violated policies yet, but keep watching." Neither guard understood. Eleanor was having conversations with ghosts only she could see. Standing before the tank that had been her home for 3 of the most intense days of her life, she found herself speaking to crew members who died inside it, whose bodies she'd pulled from burning metal, whose faces she still saw in dreams 8 decades later. "Hey, Kowalski," she whispered, too quietly for others to hear. "They got your name wrong on the placard. You always hated being called Unknown Crew. Remember how you said we'd be famous someday?" She moved to the tank's left side, eyes tracing restored armor plating once punctured by enemy fire. "Rodriguez, you did good getting us out of that jam on the 2nd day, even if the official report gave credit to the infantry." A family approached, father reading exhibit information to his teenage son who seemed more interested in his phone. Eleanor stepped aside but remained close enough to hear. "Can you believe they had women tank commanders back then, Dad?" the teenager asked without looking up. "No, son," the father corrected, checking the placard. "Says here the crew was unknown, but all tank operators were men during World War II. Women weren't allowed in combat roles until much later." Eleanor felt familiar weight of historical erasure settle on her shoulders. Official records had been classified for decades, then lost in bureaucratic shuffles, finally declassified, but with so many redactions that truth became obscured. She'd learned not to correct such misconceptions, but each instance stung. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" Marcus Thompson had approached while she was distracted. His tone was professionally courteous, but Eleanor heard underlying concern about her behavior. "I'm fine," she replied, offering a weak smile. "Just interested in the exhibit." "It's impressive," he agreed, studying her face for distress signs. "Though I have to ask you to keep conversations to a minimum. Some visitors have expressed concern." Eleanor felt heat in her cheeks. She hadn't realized her whispered words to fallen crewmates were audible to others. "I apologize. I was just remembering. Were you with the military history tour group?" Marcus asked, referring to a program bringing veterans to the museum. "Sometimes those can be emotionally challenging." "No," Eleanor said simply. "I came alone." Marcus nodded, making mental notes to continue monitoring. In his experience, solitary visitors showing emotional distress often required intervention before disrupting other guests or attempting exhibit damage. By early afternoon, Eleanor's behavior had attracted attention from multiple staff members. She'd been circling the display for 3 hours, taking periodic breaks but always returning to study the same armor sections with intense focus. Her whispered conversations became more frequent, and several visitors approached security, expressing concern about the strange woman talking to herself. Dr. Patricia Chen, Director of Visitor Services, joined Marcus at his observation point. She'd received calls from 2 tour groups requesting something be done about the disruptive visitor. "What's your assessment, Marcus?" she asked, reviewing written reports. "Difficult to say," Marcus replied, watching Eleanor trace patterns in air while looking at the main gun. "She's not violating specific policies, but her behavior is affecting other visitors. 3 families asked if she's mentally unstable." Dr. Chen observed Eleanor for several minutes, noting the woman's intense focus on details invisible to other visitors. "Has she responded to previous interactions?" "Apologetic, but doesn't seem to understand why her behavior is concerning," Marcus reported. "Claims she's just remembering, but I think she might be having some episode related to military displays." Eleanor watched the museum director approach, recognizing the purposeful stride of authority. She'd been expecting this conversation, noting how security attention had become focused and staff members began observing with obvious concern. "Good afternoon," Dr. Chen began with professional courtesy. "I'm Dr. Chen, Director of Visitor Services. I understand you've been spending considerable time with our Sherman exhibit." "It's a beautiful restoration," Eleanor replied truthfully. "Your team did exceptional work." "Thank you. Are you a military history enthusiast?" Eleanor hesitated. The simple question carried complexity layers she wasn't sure how to navigate. "You could say that." Dr. Chen noted the evasive response. "I need to address concerns raised about your visit. Several guests reported you appear to be having conversations with the exhibit, creating discomfort for families with children." "I wasn't aware I was speaking aloud," Eleanor said, voice carrying genuine embarrassment. "I'll be more careful." I appreciate that, Dr. Chen continued, but there's also how long you've been focusing on this display. While we encourage thorough examination, spending several hours in one location while displaying emotional distress tends to concern other visitors. Eleanor looked around the hall, suddenly seeing herself through others' eyes. A middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, muttering to military equipment, showing obvious emotional attachment to historical artifacts. She understood how that might appear to people who didn't know her connection to the machine before them. I can leave if you'd prefer, she offered quietly. That's not necessary, Dr. Chen replied, though her tone suggested it might become necessary. I'm simply asking that you be mindful of how your visit affects others. Perhaps you might consider viewing other exhibits. Eleanor nodded, knowing she would return to the Sherman before leaving. There were things she needed to verify, details to confirm, memories to reconcile with the museum's interpretation of events that shaped her entire life. A new group approached the tank display, elderly men wearing American Legion hats and jackets covered with military insignia. Eleanor recognized them as veterans, groups that often visited war museums, sharing stories and pointing out details civilian visitors missed. Now that's a beautiful machine, one veteran said, approaching the rope barrier with obvious appreciation. M4AE8, wet storage, 76mm gun. This variant didn't show up in the Pacific until late '44. My uncle commanded one of these in the Philippines, another added. Said the armor was reliable, but you had to know positioning against Japanese anti-tank guns. Eleanor found herself moving closer, drawn by their obvious knowledge and respect for the machine. For the first time that day, she was surrounded by people who understood the tank as something more than a museum piece. "Excuse me," she said to the veteran who mentioned his uncle. "Was he at Luzon?" The man turned with surprise. "Yes, actually. Battle for Hill 247. He was a loader in a Sherman crew. Said it was the worst 3 days of the war, but his tank commander kept them alive through the whole thing." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "What was his name?" "Your uncle?" "Private Tommy Santos. He died about 10 years ago, but he used to tell stories about this amazing tank commander. Said she was the bravest soldier he ever served with." The mention of Santos, Maria's younger brother who'd served as their loader, struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd lost track of Tommy after the war, assumed he hadn't survived subsequent Pacific campaigns. Learning he'd not only survived but spoken about their service filled her with emotions she struggled to control. "She?" one of the other veterans questioned. "Tank commanders were all men during World War II. "That's what I always thought too," Tommy's nephew replied, but Uncle Tommy swore their commander was a woman. Said she saved over 200 guys during the siege, pulled wounded soldiers into their tank under fire, kept fighting even after the rest of their crew was killed. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she listened to this second-hand account of events she'd lived through but rarely discussed. Official records had classified much of their actions, and the few declassified reports were sanitized to remove references to her gender and unconventional circumstances of her command. "That's impossible," another veteran insisted. "Women weren't allowed in combat roles. Your uncle was probably confused about details." "He wasn't confused," Tommy's nephew replied firmly. "He remembered her name and everything. Rodriguez, I think. Said she was tougher than any man he'd served with." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to confirm the story, to provide details that would validate Tommy Santos's memory, but words wouldn't come. Decades of having her service questioned had trained her to remain silent rather than face inevitable disbelief and challenges to her credibility. Marcus Thompson had been monitoring the conversation, noting how the problematic woman had inserted herself into the veteran's discussion. When he saw her obvious emotional distress, he decided to intervene. "Ma'am," he called as he approached. "I need to speak with you privately." Eleanor looked up, wiping her eyes quickly. "Is there a problem?" "We've discussed your behavior several times today," Marcus said, voice carrying authority of someone who'd reached patience limits. "You're clearly having some emotional response to exhibits that's affecting other visitors." The veterans looked between Eleanor and the security guard with confusion, unsure what had prompted intervention. "I was just listening to their conversation about the tank. Eleanor explained. "I didn't realize I was causing a disturbance." "Ma'am, you've been crying and showing distress signs most of the day. That behavior makes other visitors uncomfortable, especially families with children." One of the veterans, Frank Kowalski, who happened to share a surname with Eleanor's former gunner, stepped forward. "Officer, this lady wasn't bothering anyone. We were having a perfectly normal conversation about military history." Marcus felt the situation becoming more complicated than intended. Confronting a single distressed visitor was within his authority, but challenging a group including respected veterans required more delicate handling. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this individual has been displaying disruptive behavior throughout the day. We've had multiple complaints from other visitors." Eleanor felt familiar weight of being characterized as unstable or problematic, the same dismissive treatment she'd received from military bureaucrats, veterans administrators, and historical researchers for decades. The irony of being removed from a museum displaying her own tank wasn't lost on her. "I'll leave," she said quietly. "I don't want to cause more problems." Frank Kowalski looked at her with concern. "Ma'am, you don't have to leave. You weren't doing anything wrong." But Eleanor had already begun gathering belongings, her notebook and worn leather bag containing decades of memories and documentation. She'd been scheduled to meet Dr. Mitchell in 10 minutes to review declassified files, but the current situation made that impossible. "Wait," called Tommy Santos's nephew. "You seem to know something about that story I was telling, about the tank commander named Rodriguez." Eleanor paused, hand on her bag strap. For a moment she considered telling them everything: who she was, what she'd done, why their uncle's story was accurate in ways they couldn't imagine. But the security guard's presence and decades of disbelief stopped her. "I just found it interesting," she said. "Stories like that deserve to be remembered correctly." As she walked toward the exit, Marcus Thompson felt both relief and nagging sense that something important had slipped through his fingers. The veterans watched her departure with obvious confusion, unsure why their conversation had resulted in the woman being asked to leave. Dr. James Mitchell arrived at the Pacific Theatre Hall at exactly 3 p.m., carrying a briefcase full of declassified documents and looking forward to his meeting with Eleanor Rodriguez, the veteran whose service record had taken months to verify from scattered military archives. He looked around the exhibit area, expecting to see the woman who'd driven 8 hours to review materials that would finally provide official documentation of her crew's heroic actions during the Battle of Luzon. When she didn't appear, he approached Marcus Thompson to ask if anyone had inquired about a research appointment. "No, sir," Marcus replied. "The only unusual activity today was a problematic visitor who had to be asked to leave. Middle-aged woman, seemed to have emotional issues related to military exhibits." Dr. Mitchell felt growing unease. "Can you describe this woman?" Hispanic, early 50s, brown hair with grey streaks. She was carrying an old leather bag and seemed particularly focused on the Sherman tank display. Spent most of the day talking to herself and showing emotional distress signs. The description matched Eleanor Rodriguez perfectly, and Dr. Mitchell realized the museum's security staff had removed the very person he'd been waiting to meet. The emotional distress they'd observed was likely natural response of a veteran visiting a display of her own combat service, and talking to herself had probably been her speaking to memories of fallen comrades. Eleanor sat in her rental car in the museum parking lot, hands shaking as she tried to process what had happened. She'd driven 8 hours to finally see official recognition of her service, to meet with a researcher who'd promised to help tell the true story of Hill 247, only to be treated as disruptive and asked to leave before that meeting could occur. The leather bag on the passenger seat contained 30 years of documentation, letters, photographs, technical manuals, and personal accounts she'd written, hoping someday someone would care enough to listen. The Navy Cross buried at the bag's bottom had been awarded in a classified ceremony attended only by 3 officers, now all deceased. Her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. James Mitchell's name. "Mrs. Rodriguez? This is Dr. Mitchell from the museum. I'm afraid I may have missed you at our appointment. Are you still available to meet?" Eleanor took a breath. I was asked to leave the museum by security. They said my behavior was disruptive. There was a long pause. Mrs. Rodriguez, I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. Can you please return to the museum? I'll meet you at the main entrance and ensure there are no further issues with staff. I don't think that's a good idea. I've caused enough problems for one day. Ma'am, with all due respect, you haven't caused any problems. You're a decorated veteran visiting an exhibit that displays your own service record. If anyone has a right to be in this museum, it's you. Eleanor felt tears building again. They don't believe that. They think I'm some mentally unstable person who can't handle seeing military exhibits. Dr. Mitchell's voice became firm. Mrs. Rodriguez, I have a briefcase full of declassified documents that prove exactly who you are and what you accomplished. The museum staff made an error in judgment, and I intend to correct it immediately. Please, give me the opportunity to make this right. Against her better judgment, Eleanor found herself walking back toward the museum entrance. Dr. Mitchell was waiting, a tall man in his 40s wearing a suit marking him as administration rather than general staff. His expression mixed professional embarrassment with genuine concern. Mrs. Rodriguez, I cannot apologize enough for what happened today. I've already spoken with Dr. Chen and security staff about the misunderstanding. Eleanor followed him through the entrance, noting how security guards watched their passage with obvious confusion. Marcus Thompson looked particularly uncomfortable as Dr. Mitchell led her directly to the Pacific Theatre Hall without stopping to explain their destination. Before we discuss the documents I've brought, Dr. Mitchell said as they approached the Sherman display, I need you to know that your service record has been one of the most difficult to verify in 30 years of military research. Not because the actions didn't happen, but because so many files were classified, redacted, or lost in bureaucratic transitions. Eleanor stood before the tank again, but this time accompanied by someone who understood its significance rather than viewing her as problematic. The official record shows that an unknown Sherman crew held Hill 247 for 3 days against overwhelming enemy forces, Dr. Mitchell continued. What it doesn't show is that you were the tank commander, that you lost 3 crew members during the engagement, that you personally evacuated 47 wounded soldiers using the tank as mobile cover, and that you continued fighting with a skeleton crew until relief forces arrived. He opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. It also doesn't show that you were recommended for the Medal of Honor by your commanding officer, but the recommendation was downgraded to the Navy Cross due to concerns about publicity regarding female combat personnel. Eleanor stared at papers, many she'd never seen despite being their subject. How did you find all this? It took months of cross-referencing classified battle reports with personnel records and medical files, Dr. Mitchell explained. The breakthrough came when I found a letter written by Private Thomas Santos describing his tank commander's actions during the Battle of Luzon. He provided enough detail to trace the official records. Dr. Mitchell, I need to show you something, Eleanor said, opening her leather bag. She removed the Navy Cross, still in its original presentation case, and placed it on the display barrier next to the tank. The medal caught the museum's lighting exactly as when she first received it, the ribbon still bright despite decades of careful storage. Dr. Mitchell stared at the medal, then at Eleanor, then back at the medal. Mrs. Rodriguez, do you realize what this means? You're not just a veteran visiting a museum exhibit. You're the person this exhibit is actually about. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus Thompson's approach, who'd been instructed by Dr. Chen to monitor the situation closely but diplomatically. Dr. Mitchell, I hope everything is proceeding well, he said, tone carefully neutral despite obvious concern about the problematic visitor's return. Mr. Thompson, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Commander Eleanor Rodriguez, United States Navy, recipient of the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Luzon in 1945. Marcus Thompson looked at Eleanor with confusion. I'm sorry, sir, but this is the same individual who was asked to leave earlier due to disruptive behavior. Dr. Mitchell's expression hardened. Mr. Thompson, this woman is the tank commander whose actions are described in the exhibit you've been guarding all day. She has more right to be here than anyone else in this building. The security guard's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information: confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning realization of the magnitude of error that had been made. "Sir, we had no way of knowing. She never identified herself as military personnel." Eleanor spoke for the first time since Dr. Mitchell's introduction. "I shouldn't have to prove my service record to visit a public museum. But more importantly, I shouldn't have to justify my emotional response to seeing the machine where my crewmates died." Marcus Thompson felt the weight of professional shame settling on him. Every training course on customer service and cultural sensitivity had emphasized treating all visitors with dignity and respect, especially veterans who might be processing traumatic memories through museum visits. "Ma'am, I owe you a sincere apology. We completely misunderstood the situation." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, seeing a young man who'd made assumptions based on incomplete information rather than acting with malicious intent. "I accept your apology," she said finally, "but I need you to understand something. Every day, veterans visit museums like this one, looking for recognition of their service, trying to process experiences that civilians can't comprehend. Some of us don't fit the stereotype of what a war hero looks like." Dr. Mitchell placed the declassified documents on the display case next to Eleanor's Navy Cross. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like you to see something that will help prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future." He opened the folder to reveal a black and white photograph showing a young Eleanor Rodriguez standing next to her Sherman tank, her crew gathered around the machine's tracks. Despite the image's age and quality, there was no mistaking the woman in the photograph for anyone other than the person who'd been removed from the museum earlier. "This photograph was taken 2 days before the Battle of Hill 247, Dr. Mitchell explained. "Lieutenant Rodriguez was 24 years old when she commanded this tank during one of the most significant small unit actions of the Pacific War." Marcus Thompson studied the photograph, then looked at Eleanor with new understanding. The same eyes that had seemed troubled and unfocused earlier now appeared sharp and determined in the wartime image. The same hands that had nervously clutched a worn leather bag were shown gripping tank equipment with obvious competence. "The woman you asked to leave today," Dr. Mitchell continued, "saved the lives of 47 wounded soldiers, held a strategic position against overwhelming odds, and continued fighting even after losing most of her crew. She's one of the most decorated female veterans of World War II." By now, word had spread through the museum staff that something significant was happening in the Pacific Theatre Hall. Dr. Chen arrived, followed by several other administrators and the group of veterans who had witnessed Eleanor's earlier removal. Frank Kowalski approached Eleanor directly. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology too. When that young man was telling us about his uncle Tommy Santos, you were trying to tell us something, weren't you?" Eleanor looked at Tommy Santos's nephew, who was staring at her with growing recognition. "Your uncle was a good soldier," she said simply. "He served with honor, and his memory of events was accurate." "You're her," Tommy's nephew said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the tank commander he told us about, Rodriguez." Eleanor nodded. "Tommy was one of the best loaders I ever served with. He helped save a lot of lives during those 3 days." The group of veterans stepped closer, their earlier casual interest in the exhibit transformed into something approaching reverence. They found themselves in the presence of someone whose actions they had only heard about in stories. A living connection to history they thought existed only in museums and memorial walls. "Doctor." Chen approached Eleanor with obvious embarrassment. "Mrs. Rodriguez, on behalf of the entire museum staff, I want to apologize for how you were treated today. We failed in our fundamental responsibility to honor the veterans whose stories we tell." Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her. Security guards who had dismissed her, administrators who had questioned her behavior, veterans who now understood the significance of their earlier conversation. She felt the weight of decades of invisibility beginning to lift. "The important thing," she said, "is that Tommy Santos's story is finally being told correctly, and maybe the next veteran who visits this exhibit won't have to prove their right to remember their service." Dr. Mitchell opened another folder from his briefcase. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have a proposal. The museum would like to create a new exhibit specifically about your service and the role of female veterans in World War II. With your permission, we'd like to tell the complete story of Hill 247, including the actions that earned you the Navy Cross. Eleanor looked at the Sherman tank that had dominated her thoughts for 8 decades, then at the Navy Cross sitting beside Dr. Mitchell's documents, finally at the group of people who now understood the connection between all three. On one condition, she said, the exhibit needs to include the names of my crew members who didn't make it home. Sergeant Maria Santos, Corporal Frank Kowalski, and Private Danny Murphy. They're the real heroes of Hill 247. Frank Kowalski stepped forward. Ma'am, I think you should know. Frank Kowalski was my grandfather. Eleanor turned to him with surprise. Your grandfather was my gunner. He saved my life at least 3 times during those 3 days. And apparently, you saved his nephew Tommy's life when you pulled him into the tank after he was wounded. Eleanor felt the circle of memory completing itself in ways she had never imagined possible. The connections between past and present, between the living and the dead, between stories told and stories remembered, all converged in this moment around the machine that had defined her understanding of duty, sacrifice, and survival. As the museum staff began discussing plans for the new exhibit, Eleanor remained standing beside the Sherman tank, no longer alone with her memories, but surrounded by people who finally understood their significance. The leather bag that had held decades of unrecognized history now sat open, its contents spread across the display case like evidence in a trial where truth had finally prevailed over assumption. Marcus Thompson approached her one final time. Mrs. Rodriguez, I want you to know that what happened today will change how we train our security staff. No veteran should ever be made to feel unwelcome in a museum that tells their story. Eleanor shook his hand. Thank you, Marcus. And remember, heroes don't always look the way you expect them to. As closing time approached, Eleanor prepared to leave the museum for the 2nd time that day. But this departure would be different from the first. Instead of being escorted out by security guards who viewed her as problematic, she was accompanied by staff members eager to begin work on an exhibit that would finally tell the complete story of Hill 247. Dr. Mitchell walked with her toward the exit. Mrs. Rodriguez, when you return for the exhibit planning sessions, you'll be entering through the VIP entrance. No more questions about your credentials or your right to be here. Eleanor paused at the museum's entrance, looking back toward the Pacific Theatre Hall where her tank waited in its place of honor. Tomorrow, visitors would still see the same Sherman, but soon they would also learn about the woman who commanded it, the crew who died in it, and the soldiers who lived because of the actions taken around it during 3 days in 1945 that changed the course of the war and the lives of everyone involved. The Navy Cross rested securely in her bag, no longer a hidden reminder of unrecognized service, but a symbol of stories that demanded to be told. As she walked toward her car, Eleanor Rodriguez knew that she would never again have to prove her right to remember, to honor the dead, or to claim her place in the history that museums exist to preserve and share. The next morning, Marcus Thompson arrived for his shift to find a memo from Dr. Chen announcing new training protocols for all security staff. The memo included a photograph of Eleanor Rodriguez in her World War II uniform, standing beside her Sherman tank with the crew members who had served under her command. At the bottom of the memo, in Dr. Chen's handwriting, was a simple note: Heroes come in all forms. Our job is to honor them all.